Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast today with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's June 10th, 2020. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, we've been going through a very intense period in both the strategic situation internationally and the chaos scenario for the United States. In the period following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, we've had demonstrations, we've had violent provocations, we've had an escalation of the coup attempt against President Trump. So why don't we begin with that, Helga? There's been a lot going on. What's your assessment of how this period is unfolding?
Well, when President Trump got elected, my late husband at that point commented saying that this was not a national event of the United States, but that it had strategic implications and significance. And I think in the same way, whatever you can say about the situation in the United States is not to be judged from a national perspective, but you have to situate it in the fact that you have right now a complete breakdown of the old paradigm. This breakdown has many points to it, many aspects. Obviously, the pandemic of the coronavirus pulled away the veil of a lot of things which were already there before, but now they are crystal clear and staring into one's face with all their, in large part, ugliness. And one such ugliness was obviously what came out in this absolutely barbaric murder of George Floyd, which revealed a misdevelopment, which has many aspects. Again, one is naturally that there is racism not only in the United States but also in Europe, and we should mention that a little bit later. But that also, this police brutality, is something which was part of this paradigm shift. And again, I want to quote my late husband, who, we had an event 2 decades ago about the terrible results of video games and the so-called new violence, the brutalization of society, which is caused by video games and all this media violence. And he said that one aspect of it was that the character of the police had changed, that there was a militarization of the police, that the cop, as it existed in a community who would know everybody and many times was able to manage conflicts and bring them to a peaceful end, that he was a trusted figure in the community. That kind of a cop has completely vanished. And you had, especially in the last decades, especially with the paradigm changes after 9/11, a complete militarization of the police, and actually many techniques were military training techniques which were applied by the police. And that particular disgusting way how this white cop in Minneapolis killed George Floyd has been a tactic which has been developed by the Israelis towards the Palestinians. And many security forces actually went to Israel to be trained in this way. Now, obviously, this kind of role of the policeman in society is corresponding to what Samuel Huntington talked about, the role of the soldier in an empire. This he describes in great length in The Soldier and the State, that the the mercenary soldier should not have anything to do with the civilian economy, because otherwise he doesn't have the distance to increase his kill ratio. This book is disgusting, but it's worth reading if you want to understand what is in the mindset of these of these people. So I think that there is a reaction to this, which I don't think will go away, because what comes to the force is that a certain section of the American population, especially Afro-American, but also Hispanic, they just are completely forgotten and not participate in any of the so-called advantages which the economic system at least had up to a certain point. And this, is now coming to the force. You cannot violate the economic interest and the interest of life questions of large sections of the population over a long time, where not under conditions of a breakdown crisis this erupts. So I think, this calls for the urgent reform and reorganization of the kind we have been talking about a lot. But I want to absolutely make the point that this kind of racism is also existing in Europe. If you look at the disgusting attitude of the EU towards the refugees, if you look at Frontex, what they are doing in the Mediterranean, or even more general, we would not have a pandemic. We would not have the incredible danger to, millions of people dying potentially in the short term of famine, the terrible underdevelopment in the developing countries, if there would not be a profound racism in the so-called establishment which tolerated all of that. And I think this is very important, that it's very easy to get upset about racism in the United States or racism in Europe for that matter, if you don't take into account that this present financial economic system kept the developing sector consciously through the IMF conditionalities, through the policies backed by all the financial leading institutions in a condition of de facto slavery. I think this problem is not addressed in the right way.
Now, what we've seen is that as this thing is unfolded, the same forces that created the conditions for it to occur are now using it to turn it against President Trump, using it to divide the country. And we had a series of articles, one of which was in Atlantic Magazine, comparing what's going on in the US cities to the Maidan. How does that, what do you think about that?
Well, as I said in the beginning, the question of Trump never was a national phenomena or a national question, but Trump is being targeted the way it is happening right now from the very beginning, because he expressed the potential of improving the relationship with Russia. And in the beginning, of his presidency, he was not against China. And since the real strategic game is of these British Empire forces and their American collaborators in the form of former intelligence chiefs of the Obama administration, Wall Street, the City of London. The real game is that they want to prevent the rise of China and keep absolute geopolitical control over the world. And in that context, President Trump, who repeatedly has shown an inclination of improving relationship with Russia, this was prevented through Russiagate for 3 years. This collapsed. Then you had the impeachment. That didn't function. And now, naturally, this present situation is being used to the hilt to paint him as, the absolute, militarizer. And so that even 89 former Secretary of Defense and other top military started to distance themselves. The Economist had a huge article saying the US military is abandoning Trump. So what this is actually an effort, to really create conditions to get rid of Trump, chase him out of the White House one way or another, as the British paper Spectator already wrote in January 2017, get him out through assassination, coup, impeachment, or get him to capitulate to the agenda of the unipolar world. So I think that people are quite upset about the situation, and I think, a lot of things need to be improved dramatically. But if you judge the situation, you cannot leave out this larger picture. And what is really at stake is the question of war and peace. Because if you look what the same military faction who are now attacking Trump, what they are engaged in, it is a war drive. And it is quite interesting that of all people, Colin Powell, who after all was the one who made the infamous speech in the United Nations in 2003, motivating the attack on Iraq because supposedly Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which was a complete lie. And then Nancy Pelosi, in one of her more lucid moments, admitted that they all knew, including Colin Powell, when he made that speech, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. So these are the people who are for permanent wars, who are for, basically encircling Russia, encircling China. This is now what is being openly discussed again. There was an article by the son of Brzezinski, Ian Brzezinski, who called for a NATO China Council, pushing essentially the idea to expand NATO to the Pacific. This was then the subject of another meeting of the Atlantic Council, where Stoltenberg talked about his so-called Vision 2030, where he said, yes, we have to absolutely expand NATO, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, by basically making it a global military alliance surrounding Russia and China. And this is a war push which will lead to World War III if it's not stopped. And there was this news that there was a meeting of the National Security Council on the 15th of May discussing the possible resumption of nuclear testing on the side of the United States. This has not been officially confirmed, at least I haven't found any proof of it, but there was a very strong reaction by Chinese media saying, that this is a matter of grave concern because obviously it would violate the nuclear test ban treaty. And if you take that together with this whole push of pushing NATO troops further to the Russian border, I think people should really understand that we are not out of the war danger at all. And Trump has shown too many signs that he wants to have peace. He even talked about a possible meeting between himself and Putin and Xi Jinping to discuss global disarmament of especially nuclear weapons. He said at the time it's a complete waste of money to spend all of this money on rearmament. And naturally, in the ears of the military-industrial complex, this is what they really don't want to hear, and they want to keep the permanent wars going. And this is really what the issue is. And a lot of people who are so absolutely hyped up against Trump tend to overlook that, and they are pushing actually policies, which are condoning something which could lead to World War III.
I think what you just said is extremely important for people to think about because they're being forced into a situation of choosing sides that are phony sides. Are you for Trump using police and military to put down riots? Is Trump a racist? And on and on and on. If you actually look at this militarization of the police question, which you brought up earlier, which Lyndon LaRouche talked about, you go back to Bush and the Patriot Act. You go back to Obama, who is the one who made surplus military equipment available to the police. And then you look at the other question, the extension of NATO. Well, Trump has been the one questioning whether NATO is even should exist in this world. So there really is an operation to take a complex situation and make it unintelligible for the average person, isn't there?
Yes, and since people don't think they don't think through the implications of things. So, for example, I think it's very, very interesting that if you look, who are the key rebel rousers on this confrontation? You have Pompeo, you have the British, you have Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, who are absolutely, Pompeo is comparing China with the Nazis. I mean, he got a good answer from the editor-in-chief of Global Times saying that, he is more like Goebbels. But Chris Patten, calling basically on Hong Kong people to rise. Boris Johnson wants to basically import 3 million Chinese from Hong Kong by offering visas. But basically, this ring around Russia, ring around China. And who is supporting that? Well, it's the Greens. The Green Party in Germany is the war party. Not only is the Green policy, um, if they would run basically the government right now, which should be prevented by all means, that would be the death nail of the German economy. Not only is their policy towards the developing sector one of depopulation, either explicit or by implication, because if you deny development, then you have nothing to stop this famine or to stop the pandemic and prevent millions of people to die. But they are also the war party because the new interparliamentarian alliance, which has been formed by such hawks like Marco Rubio or Ted Menendez, who are really the absolute hawks in the US picture. Who is part of it? Bütikofer, European Parliament member of the Green Party. Who is backing Chris Patten and Pompeo? Claudia Roth. So I think the and the evil role of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in their anti-Russian ravings is also quite visible. So the Greens are really a problem, and I think people like nature and they like sunflowers. They don't think through what it means that the Greens are on the same line like the absolute top warmongers in the confrontation against Russia and China, which can only lead to a catastrophe. So I think people should think through and not take single issues, but look at things in their totality.
And that's not so surprising with the Greens, given that the other side of the Green New Deal is that it's Wall Street and the City of London. Former chairman of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, Larry Fink from BlackRock, these are the people who are pushing the Green New Deal. So there's a total continuity there. I want to go back to this question, though, of the attacks in the United States. And this led to a very poignant statement from a former ambassador from an African nation about the situation involving your husband. And I'd like you to just mention that, let people get a sense of how this is being viewed from very well-informed people.
Yes, this is very important. This is the former ambassador of Burundi to the United States who wrote a message commenting on the events around the murder of George Floyd. This is Ambassador Baka Mwavanka, who was for many years ambassador in Washington. And, he wrote a message which, when I first heard it, it really turned my stomach, because he said that, that what happened to George Floyd was essentially the same thing what happened politically to Lyndon LaRouche in the United States, and that he was basically getting the same treatment, that somebody put their knee on his neck and basically trying to extinct his ideas. He said they did not succeed in doing it, but that that the only way how this injustice could be undone would be the full exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, and that would be the best thing for the world to happen. Now he formulated it in even stronger language, and I think this image, while it is very upsetting, I think it is absolutely true, because what was done against my husband in terms of demonizing him, his ideas, to unjustly put him in jail, to try to destroy our movement while he was in jail, which obviously they did not succeed. But the methods used are absolutely identical. And I find it quite incredible that today the Swedish government announced that the murder case, the investigation of the murder of Olof Palme, former Prime Minister of Sweden, is now closed. That the very likely assassin was a person with the name of Strid Engström, who at the time had come forward as a witness to the murder, but that was actually his cover, that he himself was it, and that information was basically given to the Swedish intelligence services by South African intelligence. In any case, it is now closed. Now, I want to say this, that they did not apologize to my husband, including all the scoundrels of the media, is telling about their their statue and their moral standing, because I want to recall, and some people may remember that when Olof Palme was assassinated on the 28th of February in 1986, you know, shortly thereafter, we had an election campaign in Illinois where two of the members of the LaRouche organization won the primaries of the in the Democratic Party, the number 2 and number 3 place, and immediately with that victory, you had a slender campaign basically blaming our organization in Sweden of having been involved in the murder of Palme, of accusing my husband of having masterminded the assassination of Palme. And you had an unbelievable press barrage, a black propaganda campaign. Aftonbladet had several, long articles going over 10 pages, 8 pages, slandering my husband. NBC TV, a terrible woman called Pat Lynch, made a so-called documentary documenting the supposed involvement of LaRouche in the Palme murder. And all of that was done to poison the atmosphere, so that basically, no other candidates of the LaRouche movement could possibly win an election, but also preparing the ground for the raid which occurred in October in that year, 86, and then as a consequence of that, creating the phony environment for the jailing of my husband and many of his associates. Because it's the same thing, if you want to make war against somebody, you have to demonize them first. So if you look at the demonization against my husband with something which was completely invented, that was part of the legal frame up which Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the United States in the Johnson administration, who became the lawyer of my husband, he said this was the worst case of breaking of the law, of bending of justice in the history of the United States. And, in the Swedish media later, as part of this revelation, a little bit later, much later actually, a guy called Herbert Bremer, an ex-Stasi officer, basically said that he was one person of something called the Department 10 of the Stasi, that was the secret service of the GDR, that they invented it to blame this on LaRouche. And then they played it, through the media, and this is how it was orchestrated. Now, that lesson has to be learned, because if you look at a lot of, you would now call it fake news, but if you had a really fake news, then it was this story that LaRouche was responsible for the Palme murder. Now, this came out now, it was not the case. So I really demand from the Swedish government that they make a statement where they say that all the accusations against Lyndon LaRouche and his movement were a mistake, and they apologize. And if there would be any honor in NBC, they would do the same thing. Now, that is a big question mark. I leave the answer to them, but given the fact that they are in the business of fake news production, it is very unlikely. But I think the using of these techniques, what the ambassador from Burundi said, is absolutely true, and the conditions around the Palme murder are just one proof. You don't have to use your knee to try to murder somebody. You can also use the pencil and the typewriters and the electronic media, as it has been done by the media. But I really want to state that it's really time that the truth comes out. Who did this and why? And if you want to ever get justice anywhere, the truth has to come out.
I think this is also important when you look at what President Trump insists, that he wants to get to the bottom of the Russiagate situation so something like this will never happen again. Had that been done with the LaRouche case, had people taken up the fraud of the attacks on Lyndon LaRouche, the role of the media, the deployment of people like Robert Mueller as a hitman for the Justice Department against LaRouche, perhaps we never would have had Russiagate. So this has an absolutely current, contemporary, urgent aspect to it, and that's why we're continuing to insist on the exoneration of LaRouche, not just by NBC and the Swedish government, but by the US government, by the corrupt permanent bureaucracy in the Justice Department, and people like Henry Kissinger and others who worked on this. Now, Helga, there are a couple of other things I want to get to. One is that you've continued to make an absolutely urgent point about the program from the LaRouche PAC for 1.5 billion new productive jobs connected worldwide, connected to the Health Silk Road. We're seeing a spread of the coronavirus in the Southern Hemisphere. It still remains to be seen whether we're facing a second wave in the North. What kind of update do you have on this?
Well, I think the situation in some countries like Brazil is horrific. You have spikes in India, in South Africa, and the situation remains absolutely horrible. And also there, the ugliness of the uh, mindset of certain governments, which covered up the fact that the privatization of the health sector meant that simply the facilities were not there to treat the patients when the pandemic erupted. There are now these scandals coming out. In Madrid, there is now a total uproar because the regional government of Madrid actually gave written instructions to the nursing homes that people who would get sick with coronavirus in nursing homes should not be sent to hospitals to be treated. 6,000 people died in Madrid nursing homes, and only 13% of those got actually into the hospital. The others were only given morphine and died after 1, 2, or 3 days. Now, that is euthanasia. I mean, that is, that is the kind of slippery slope, which was discussed in Nuremberg, and it reveals, it reveals really the ugly side of what is behind the privatization of medical care. A similar scandal is now erupting in Lombardy, in Bergamo, and this was the hotspot in Italy, where I think 20,000 or so families are suing the authorities of not having given treatment in the necessary way to their family members. I think this is all terrible, and I think the only remedy to this whole situation is we absolutely have to change the economic system. I mean, we still have a complete collapse of the economy, and all these predictions that that just because you have a lowering of the infection rate, that we will have a V recovery, meaning like a letter V, that it went down very sharply and is now going up very sharply. I think this is questionable because the right kinds of policies have not yet been put in. you have an incredible collapse of industrial production, 50 million unemployed in the United States, a production collapse of almost 30% in Germany, 15% over the months, but 25% industrial collapse over the year. Similar figures in the other European countries. And that is not the end of it, because a lot of people have been put on short work. And if you do not have a real investment in industry and productive jobs, there is a big question mark, what will happen to these short-time workplaces, when the time span ends where these short-time work programs are being supported. So that is why our program to have the 1.5 billion production investment in new productive jobs, 50 million in the United States, 50 million for Europe, because if you count all the different problem areas like the southern European countries, the Balkans, but also the terrible condition of infrastructure and other things in Germany, and naturally then that has to become the engine for a huge technology transfer to the developing countries, starting with investment in the World Health System. And that has not yet happened, and that is what we are campaigning for, and that is what I'm asking you, our viewers, to absolutely join our campaign to get that program on the agenda, because that will determine how this present situation will evolve.
Well, that program is available on LaRouchePAC.com. People can download it, read it, and engage others in discussions. Also, Helga, it's just been announced that the Schiller Institute will be holding another online conference on June 27th. The invitation to that is now up on I think it's up on the Schiller Institute site. Anything you want to say about that?
Yes, that will be a continuation of what we did on April 25th and 26th. It will be a strategic panel where we will try again to bring representatives of the most important nations, to start the kind of dialogue on the solution of a new Bretton Woods system among the United States, Russia, China, India, countries from Europe, from Africa, because we have to somehow bring on the agenda the need to have a change from a monetary system to a credit policy, because without that reorganization of a bankrupt system, if the central banks are just continuing to do the kind of money printing they are doing, which does not go primarily in industry, but it goes primarily in maintaining the speculative banking sector, it will lead to hyperinflation despite the deflationary collapse, which is also ongoing. So that will be one panel. There will be important speakers addressing the new paradigm in international relations. And then the second panel will address the looming danger of a famine, the collapse of agriculture, how this affects especially the countries of Africa, and what needs to be done to double world food production. And there we will have a lot of very fascinating speakers from Africa and agriculture. And so I want to invite you not only to join, but to make as known as possible that this conference will exist. And you should join the bandwagon of people who try to really change the agenda of the world, which is urgently needed.
Well, as I said, the invitation is available now on the website. You can take it, share it, and do what you can to help build this conference so people can get out from under the chaos and fog of war and start deliberating as citizens. So Helga, thank you very much for joining us today, and I guess we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.